We're going to be making pastry now, which is a really good skill to have. It's a very versatile thing to be able to make. And the type of pastry that I'm going to show you now, and there are lots of different sorts, but this one is short crust pastry, particularly helpful for pies and things because it crisps up nicely and makes a nice top. You can also use it for things like jam tarts or mince pies, any of those sorts of things. Now the trick to making pastry is to have all your ingredients really cold. So I have just taken my margarine and my lard out of the fridge, and I have just run my hands under a really cold tap so that my hands are also really cold before we start. And I've got ready here a pie plate. You can use any sort of plate, even a kitchen plate, as long as it's oven proof, but you really want something that's got a rim around the edge of it because you're going to stick the edge of the pie to that effectively. So in this bowl here I've got 6 ounces of plain flour and 1.5 ounces each of margarine and lard, and I'm just literally going to break that up and drop it into the flour to start with, and then we're going to use a methodology which is called rubbing in. Now you actually want to handle this stuff as little as you possibly can. You don't want it warming up, you're actually wanting the fat to become completely coated in flour and mix in with that flour, but without it melting in any way. You don't want the melting process of the fat to start happening until you put it in a hot oven, because it's that keeps the pastry really short, and that means basically crumbly when you make it. So just very roughly chop that, and then I'm afraid this is time for your hands to go in. Now if you can try and do it rubbing in like this with your thumbs over the top of your fingers and literally squashing that fat as lightly as you possibly can, keeping air and therefore coolness underneath that flour as you're rubbing it in. Don't let it get too warm. This will take a few minutes to do. You just need to be patient. Just keep on rubbing with the ends of your fingers and your thumbs that fat, breaking it down and it coating in the flour as you go. And you'll see by the time we finish doing this that it will resemble a sort of fine breadcrumb texture. So you can see now that I'm at the point that this looks like fine breadcrumbs. Just give it a quick going over to make sure that you haven't got any large lumps of fat left in there that haven't been mixed in, but you can see that's the consistency that you're aiming for. And then we're going to add the water. Now again, this is really cold water. I'm making this on a cold spring day, but if you're making this in the summer you do need to work quickly and keep going back for the coolness. So this is really cold tap water, and you need to just be careful about this. I'm going to add 2 tablespoons to start with and then chop that in with my palette knife, and then we'll see how dry it is, because once you've added too much water there's not a lot you can do to escape from that really, so be careful and do it gradually. So that's 2 tablespoons in there, and then I'm just using a palette knife. You can use an ordinary table knife, but again just try and cut through like this to mix the water in. And I don't know whether you can see, but that is just now beginning to bring that breadcrumb type mixture together into slightly larger pieces of mixture as the water gets in there and starts to bring all of that together. Now if you use the flat side of your knife and give it a bit of a prod, you'll begin to feel whether that is coming together in a ball of pastry or not, and I can already tell that that doesn't have enough mixture in it. It's not coming together in a ball enough. So given that's how it feels to me now, I'm going to add another whole tablespoon of cold water now. The amount of water that you will add will also depend on the particular flour you're using, and that varies from manufacturer to manufacturer. It varies on the particular grain that they've used to make the flour with. So this is a bit of trial and error, and you just have to kind of learn a sense of it. So having chopped that through, and you can see now that's quite big lumps in there, now is the time to stick a hand in and see whether when you squeeze this will come together. And you can see that is now forming a ball which is collecting all of the mixture up. Scrape it all out of your bowl. That's it all. But again, you don't want to overhandle this, you don't want the mixture to grow warm, so it's not like bread where you would be kneading this, it is just a kind of a gentle shaping and forming of that. And then if this was a really hot summer's day now, I would be literally wrapping that in cling film and popping it in my fridge for half an hour to chill it right back down again. But as it's not, I can start working with that and start rolling it out to make my pastry pie. So while our pastry is in the fridge cooling, if we were cooling it, that's the point at which you can prepare your apples. Now you could do your apples first before you start making the pastry. Just leave them in a bowl of cold water to stop them going brown. But if you do that, you need to drain them really well and make sure they're nice and dry, because a lot of liquid will come out of the apples, and if you don't dry them off and make sure those pieces of apple are dry, you'll end up with a really soggy inside, which will then make the bottom of your pastry base of your pie soggy as well. So just to prepare the apples, all I'm going to do, these I'm actually using eating apples. If I was using cooking apples, I would chop them into chunks and I would add a little bit of sugar and I would peel them, because an eating apple is much, much sourer. But I'm using a Braeburn apple here, so I'm just literally going to take the core out and I'm going to leave my skins on mine and just slice those or chunk them up to go in the centre of my pie. So I will get that filling ready now. So I've taken the total mixture that we made and I've just lightly floured the surface that I'm going to be using to roll this out on. It's a nice metal surface, this is cold again, but if you've got a glass board or something like that, that will be cold too. And I've cut it kind of 3/5 and 2/5, so slightly more for rolling the base out than for the top that's going to go on it. So I'm going to just set the top aside and just work this round into a round to start with. And the theory is if you start with a round shape, hopefully, and roll it evenly, you'll finish up with a round shape to go in your pie. So I'm just going to start rolling and turn, roll and turn, roll and turn. Keep moving it around to keep flour underneath so that it doesn't stick to the base. Lower your rolling pin as well. You can see it's just beginning to break a little bit on the surface, so a bit more flour. That's getting quite thin. I like my pastry thin, but you just need to be careful that it doesn't break as you move it when it is thin like that. Give it a measure with the plate, check it's roughly the right size. You'll be able to stretch that a little bit when it goes in, as it goes in. And then I'm just going to get my finger and take a little bit of that water and just slightly wet the rim of that pie plate, because that will help the pastry to stick to it. And you don't want it, you want it to be held on the edge of the pie dish, because if not it'll just shrink in. And part of wetting it is hopefully to hold it in place on that rim. And then just roll your pastry round your rolling pin to hold it up so that it doesn't stretch too much as you move it. Lay it onto the top of your dish, and then just where you need to, just work that press it in. Now, sometimes you end up with a bit of a patchwork, certainly I do with pastries. You can see there's one or two places where there's a bit too much and one or two places where there's not enough. So don't worry about that. You'll be able to feel under here a little bit of air where it's trapped underneath the dish. So just ease that and push it flat to the dish so that you haven't got trapped air underneath, because that air, as it warms in the oven, the air expands. And what that will do then is to push the pastry off the bottom of the dish. It'll crack and split, and then your filling will all pour out underneath. So then I'm just literally going to take a couple of bits off the edge of this pie plate here and just use them to fill in here. It doesn't matter, this is just the underneath piece, but I do want enough pastry so that the lid will stick to this when I come to put it on. So just fill in those gaps a little bit if you can. Now I'm using eating apples, which means they're nice and sweet. You can use cooking apples for this as well. In fact, cooking apples are probably better, but you tend to be able to get those more cheaply in the autumn. You can pick any fruit really. You can pick it from hedgerows, you can get apples off wild apple trees, blackberries, plums, anything you can see around. You often see a plum tree nowadays that's got all its fruit fallen on the ground, just going to waste. So pick it, take it home, chop it and freeze it, and then you can use it like this as a fruit pie filling afterwards. Similarly with blackberries, get them in your freezer and then you've got them right the way through the winter to use in pies or crumbles or whatever you want. So because these are eating apples, they don't need any sugar in them. They're sweet enough as they are, and we don't need to add sugar to our recipes unless we need to. So I'm just literally going to pile the apple in here. Spread it around. Don't worry that it's raised up over the level of the pie at the moment, because as that cooks and cooks down, that's why I've left my apple quite chunky. As it cooks down, the height of that will drop. So for the purposes of now, we want that to be a little bit higher and make a raised lid. So then I'm just now going to take the other piece of pastry and roll that out to make a lid for my pie. I've rolled out my other half of my pastry into a sort of circle shape. You will need to assess the size of your dish and work out the quantity of pastry you need. As you can see, my dish isn't an enormous dish, but it probably isn't the smallest dish, and I've used 6 ounces of flour in my mixture. But you know, if you're not going to be good at rolling it out, or you've got a slightly bigger dish, you're going to need 8 ounces of flour. So I've just literally gone round the rim of that to wet that pastry, and I'm going to lift this now onto the top and then stick the 2 layers together on the edge. To use exactly the same technique or methodology for making pastry for a meat pie. Don't worry if it doesn't sit exactly right. Just push this down around the edge to seal these 2 layers together, wherever they are. And then I use a fork and just imprint like this around the edge. Now the reason you're doing that is to seal those 2 layers together with the water that you put round there, so that when they cook, the lid doesn't separate from the underneath of the pie. And the shorter pastry you've made, so if you've managed to get away with this as I have here, you can see it's quite crumbly. That will be beautiful to eat, lovely and crumbly as you eat it, very short crust pastry, but it does mean it's harder to work with here without it falling to pieces. So I could have added just fractionally more, and when I say fractionally, I'm talking a quarter or half a teaspoon more of water into that. I would have made it less short, but in my opinion, not so nice. And then because the inside is going to warm up, the hot air that's inevitably inside that pie will expand as it heats, and it will push or lift the top, you actually want the steam to be escaping. So I'm going to take a knife and I'm just going to poke a couple of holes like that, just gently through, because that will just let the steam out of the pie as it's cooking. Now if you want to, you can glaze the top of your pie with a little bit of milk. You could do it with beaten egg. I'm not going to do that because I've got people in my house that have got allergies, so we're going to have it as it is. But if you did that, it might give it a slightly more golden colour as it cooks. That's going to go into the oven on 180 degrees in a fan oven, or 200 degrees centigrade in a non-fan oven, and cook it for about 30 to 40 minutes. Keep an eye on it. The apple won't take long to cook in the middle, but you do want the pastry cooked throughout. Yes, that's it, apple pie.